April 29, 1945 settled over Berlin like a shroud. Smoke hung in the air, thick and choking, drifting from the bombed-out ruins of buildings that once symbolized the might of the Third Reich. The distant rumble of artillery echoed through the streets, a relentless rhythm that signaled the encroaching Soviet forces. The city was a graveyard, littered with rubble, the husks of vehicles, and the bodies of those who had not fled. Yet beneath this devastated landscape, a small, subterranean world remained intact, stubbornly insulated from the chaos above. The Führer bunker. Hitler awoke in his private quarters, the flickering candlelight casting deep shadows across his gaunt face. His eyes, hollow and dark, reflected the weight of the empire he had built and was now losing. Outside, the once grand city of Berlin was under siege. Inside, the bunker was a claustrophobic maze of concrete corridors, low-ceilinged rooms, and dimly lit chambers. Officers moved silently, their boots echoing faintly against the cold floors, while secretaries and aides carried out their tasks with an eerie, hollow efficiency. Every sound, every whispered conversation felt amplified in the tight spaces, a constant reminder of the tension that gripped the underground fortress. Reports had been coming in all night. Maps were sprawled across tables in the command room, marked with red symbols indicating Soviet positions. The news was grim. The Soviets had breached Berlin's outer defenses, artillery and tanks advancing street by street, inch by inch. Communications with remaining Wehrmacht units were inconsistent, and morale among those still fighting was collapsing. Yet Hitler refused to leave. He believed, as he always had, that destiny favored him. The Führer's obsession with symbolism, control, and ideological narrative had blinded him to the reality that his city was falling and his regime had reached its final hours. The morning began with a meeting of his inner circle. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, General Wilhelm Burgdorf, and others gathered in a dimly lit conference room. The air was thick with smoke from the coal-fired heaters, mingling with the scent of unwashed bodies and anxiety. Goebbels spoke in hushed tones, his words attempting to balance hope with the grim truth. The Führer's orders must be followed, he said, his voice firm yet strained. Berlin must hold. Hitler entered the room, his posture stiff but commanding. He did not look at the maps. He did not acknowledge the reports. Instead, he spoke in measured, deliberate sentences, reminding his followers of the ideology that had driven them for more than a decade. His voice, though weakened by stress and illness, carried the same authority that had once commanded millions. He spoke of loyalty, sacrifice, and the inevitability of victory, ignoring the reality that victory was no longer within reach. Eva Braun arrived shortly afterward, bringing with her a small sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. Her presence, though comforting to Hitler, was also a stark reminder of the world outside the bunker, a world he would never see again. She moved quietly, performing her duties, her eyes reflecting a mixture of resolve, fear, and sorrow. The two shared fleeting moments of personal connection, brief respites from the unrelenting tension that surrounded them. Yet even these moments were heavy with the awareness that the end was near. Throughout the bunker, the mood was a mixture of anxiety, disbelief, and grim determination. Officers whispered about the city above, about Soviet advances, about units surrendering or being annihilated. Secretaries and aides moved silently, carrying messages and performing tasks, their faces pale from exhaustion and fear. The corridors echoed with the distant roar of artillery, punctuated by the occasional scream or shout from the surface. A world collapsing above, while below, a small cadre of men and women clung to routines that had become increasingly meaningless. As the hours passed, Hitler retreated into his private office. He pored over maps, making notations that were increasingly disconnected from reality. Reports indicated the final Soviet assault positions, the destruction of strategic points, and the disintegration of German morale. Yet Hitler remained focused on ideological considerations: how to preserve the Reich's honor, how to ensure the legacy of National Socialism, how to avoid surrender. His inner circle watched silently, their expressions a combination of loyalty, fear, and disbelief. In these early hours, discussions turned to logistics and personal affairs. Hitler dictated messages to his staff, preparing statements and documents to be preserved or destroyed. Eva Braun moved quietly, assisting where needed, but also preparing herself for what she knew must come. Bormann and Goebbels circulated among the officers, issuing orders, coordinating defenses that were increasingly symbolic rather than practical. Every plan, every directive, was a testament to desperation, a ritual attempting to impose order on chaos. The afternoon brought a new level of tension. Reports arrived of Soviet troops reaching key positions within central Berlin. The sound of artillery fire grew louder, more insistent. Windows in the upper parts of the bunker rattled with each explosion, and dust fell from the ceilings. Hitler summoned his generals, insisting on updated reports and the continuation of the defense. The generals, knowing full well the futility of resistance, presented cautious assessments, hoping to avoid provoking anger or despair. Hitler listened, absorbed, yet ultimately dismissed their advice, convinced that victory, or at least controlled withdrawal, was still possible. Late in the day, Hitler received additional news from Goebbels about the morale and readiness of remaining troops. The reality was stark. Many units were fragmented, their leaders killed or captured, their ammunition and supplies exhausted. Soviet forces were advancing from all directions, and the hope of external reinforcement had vanished. Hitler's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and rage. He scribbled notes, sometimes crossing out entire sections, muttering about betrayal, incompetence, and the inevitability of history recognizing him as Germany's ultimate leader. As night fell over Berlin, the bunker became an oppressive maze of shadows and muffled sound. The distant artillery created a ceaseless, thundering rhythm. Officers moved quietly, performing their duties, aware that each moment could be their last. Hitler and Eva Braun shared brief conversations in private rooms, exchanging few words, yet conveying volumes in gestures and glances. The human element of fear, loyalty, and resignation was palpable, wrapping the concrete walls in an invisible tension. Throughout the night, the bunker staff carried on with tasks that were increasingly ceremonial. Messages were delivered, orders written, and personal preparations were made. Some officers contemplated their own survival, whispering about escape or surrender. Others remained steadfast, clinging to loyalty even as hope vanished. The contrast between ideological certainty and practical reality created a pervasive atmosphere of psychological tension, thick and suffocating. By early morning on April 30, 1945, Hitler's demeanor had grown more subdued. He spent time alone, reviewing documents, considering what remained to be done. Eva Braun joined him briefly, her presence a small comfort. The decisions he faced were no longer about strategy, but about legacy, symbolism, and the inevitable conclusion of a failed empire. The bunker, once a hub of command, had become a tomb of ideas and ambition, a microcosm of a collapsing world. Throughout the bunker, minor crises continued: a generator failure here, a communication interruption there, the faint sound of distant gunfire amplified by the concrete corridors. Officers and aides adapted, moving efficiently, yet the underlying tension never dissipated. Every action, every decision was weighted by the knowledge that history was closing in on them, that the city above was being irreversibly consumed by the Soviet advance. By mid-morning, Hitler began final preparations. He dictated personal instructions to Bormann and Goebbels, specifying the distribution of documents, the handling of personal effects, and the management of staff. Each note and instruction carried a sense of ritual, a desperate attempt to impose order on chaos. The contrast between meticulous planning and the reality of annihilation was stark. The bunker's walls, lined with maps, radios, and relics of command, seemed to absorb the despair, echoing every whispered conversation and hurried step. The human element became more apparent as officers confronted their personal dilemmas. Some wrote letters to families, others attempted brief prayers or personal reflection. The juxtaposition of personal vulnerability and ideological resolve created moments of tension, fear, and emotional resonance that contrasted sharply with the broader historical context: the unstoppable Soviet advance, the collapse of Germany, and the imminent end of the Third Reich. Even as the afternoon approached, the bunker maintained a facade of activity. Secretaries typed furiously, messengers delivered reports, and officers issued commands. Yet the knowledge of impending doom hung like a shadow over every action. The psychological interplay of fear, loyalty, resignation, and denial created a tension that was almost tangible, as if the walls themselves were aware of the tragic conclusion approaching. The final hours and aftermath. Inside Hitler's bunker, April 30 to May 1, 1945. The dawn of April 30, 1945 broke over a shattered Berlin. Outside, the city was a battlefield. Streets littered with the carcasses of tanks and soldiers, smoke rising from smoldering ruins. Soviet artillery hammered relentlessly, punctuating the air with deafening explosions. Inside the Führer bunker, however, the subterranean world moved at a different rhythm, tense, deliberate, almost ritualistic. The contrast between the chaos above and the eerie calm below was striking. The bunker, a reinforced concrete labyrinth, was now the heart of Germany's last defense, but it was also a tomb, sealing its inhabitants in history's most infamous final hours. Hitler spent the early morning hours in his private quarters, reviewing documents and directives. His face, pale and drawn, bore the unmistakable marks of stress, illness, and obsession. Eva Braun moved quietly around the room, assisting with preparations, yet maintaining a composed presence. The couple had married in a brief, private ceremony the day before, a final assertion of personal agency amidst the collapse of a global empire. The act was both intimate and symbolic, reflecting a human desire for connection, even as the world they knew dissolved around them. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann coordinated the remaining loyal staff, issuing orders, maintaining appearances, and attempting to preserve the Reich's dignity. Radios crackled with sporadic reports, confirming the inevitable. Soviet forces were penetrating the city center. German resistance had disintegrated in most sectors, and any hope of relief had evaporated. Officers whispered in corridors, some contemplating escape, others resigning themselves to death. Every movement carried weight. Every step could be the last. The tension was palpable, almost suffocating. Hitler's attention, however, remained fixed on ideological matters. He dictated his last political testament, insisting on the preservation of the Nazi narrative, the assignment of blame, and the careful allocation of responsibility for remaining government officials. Each sentence was measured, deliberate, almost ritualistic, an attempt to impose order on a collapsing world. He moved with mechanical precision, alternating between moments of intense focus and deep, silent reflection. Eva Braun observed quietly, her own demeanor, calm but yet sorrowful, fully aware of what was to come. In the early afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to a private room. The couple shared a final, solemn conversation, their words sparse yet laden with meaning. The weight of their choices was immense, their expressions betraying resignation and a quiet resolve. They had lived for a moment entirely within their own world, shielded by concrete and secrecy, while above, Berlin burned and crumbled. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun ingested their cyanide capsules. The act was swift, deliberate, and irreversible. The Führer slumped forward, lifeless, his eyes fixed on nothing, the culmination of a decade of ambition, ideology, and devastation. Eva Braun followed shortly thereafter, leaving the bunker's private quarters silent, a stark contrast to the roar of war above. The finality of their deaths marked not just the end of two lives, but the collapse of an entire vision of the world. Joseph Goebbels, now the de facto leader within the bunker, confronted the reality of Hitler's absence. He gathered his family, discussing their next steps with a grim determination. Magda Goebbels, resolute yet trembling, understood the impossible choices before them. In a final, tragic act, she took the lives of her 6 children before turning the gun on herself. The bunker, once a hub of ideological command, was now a mausoleum of despair and desperation. Throughout the afternoon and evening, the bunker staff attempted to continue operations. Messages were sent, plans for escape considered, but the encroaching Soviet forces rendered all options moot. Communications from the outside were intermittent, and the streets above were engulfed in combat, rubble, and fire. The psychological toll was immense. The contrast between hope and inevitability created an atmosphere of profound tension, fear, and sorrow. By nightfall, the bunker had descended into near silence. The concrete walls absorbed the distant sounds of artillery and gunfire, creating an eerie echo that seemed to symbolize the Reich's collapse. Officers and staff moved through corridors with slow, deliberate steps, their faces reflecting exhaustion and grief. The human cost of history's most infamous final hours was palpable, each individual a testament to loyalty, fear, or resignation. In the hours following Hitler and Eva Braun's deaths, Goebbels and Bormann attempted to maintain order. They oversaw the destruction of documents, the burning of sensitive files, and the coordination of remaining personnel. Every action was imbued with a sense of ritual, a desperate attempt to preserve the dignity and secrecy of a crumbling empire. Yet the inevitability of collapse pressed relentlessly against them. The night of April 30th gave way to the early hours of May 1st, 1945. Soviet forces had breached key points within the city, their presence becoming unmistakable. Smoke and fire illuminated the ruins above, casting flickering shadows into the bunker's corridors. Goebbels' inner circle moved with cautious precision, issuing orders, tending to communications, and preparing for the final acts of the regime. The human drama within these underground halls reflected both courage and despair, resolve and futility in equal measure. In a final, calculated act, Goebbels and Magda ended their lives, along with their children, ensuring that the family's tragic narrative would close alongside Hitler's demise. Bormann, whose fate remained partially shrouded in mystery, attempted escape into the crumbling city, a solitary figure moving through the chaos that had consumed Berlin. The bunker, once a fortress of command and ideology, now stood empty of leadership, a hollow echo of ambition, fanaticism, and ultimate failure. As the day progressed, Soviet forces discovered and entered the bunker complex. The rooms that had witnessed secretive conversations, frantic planning, and personal despair were now exposed to the world. Documents, personal effects, and the remnants of lives lived under fear and obedience were catalogued and preserved. The evidence of the Third Reich's final hours provided historians with an intimate view of ideology collapsing under the weight of reality, and of human lives caught in the machinery of history. The story of the Führerbunker serves not merely as a chronicle of death and defeat, but as a lesson in ambition, obsession, and the inexorable consequences of power pursued without restraint. Within these subterranean corridors, history's most infamous dictator met his end alongside those closest to him as the world above advanced relentlessly. Every detail, the panic, the ritualistic actions, the human emotions, paints a vivid portrait of a regime's final moments, demonstrating both the fragility of human constructions and the inevitability of historical judgment. As daylight faded on May 1st, Berlin remained a city in flames, its streets a battlefield, its people exhausted and terrorized. The Führerbunker, silent now, bore witness to the culmination of ideology, ambition, and fear. The Third Reich, for all its power and terror, had reached its final hour. Yet the lessons of these final 48 hours endure, reminding the world of the human capacity for both obsession and tragedy, of the costs of unchecked power, and of the stark realities that lie behind the headlines of history.